Good morning. Welcome to our first middle level webinar of the semester. We're going to be talking about vocabulary strategies specifically for AOR 7.1. We have shifted to a 1 hour webinar model as opposed to 2 hour, which is what we were doing last year. So hopefully you'll find this hour to be jam-packed and quick moving, but also full of information that you can pass on, either use or pass on to the teachers that you serve and support. So we will go ahead and get started. If you will make sure that as you come in, your microphone is muted, unless you want to unmute to speak or answer a question or just collaborate. And we are recording this, so the recording as well as the presentation and resources will be shared out following the webinar. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We do want to begin with a disclaimer on the use of artificial intelligence. So we just like you all to know that the content that is presented in our webinars is property of the SCDE, and that we ask that you turn off any AI tools that you may have. So if you have a co-pilot in the chat taking notes for you, if you could turn those off for us, and throughout the presentation, make sure that they remain off. Again, you will get a copy of the recording as well as the slide deck. We're going to start with some introductions. My name is Brenna McCormick, and I'm the Middle Level ELA Education Associate to support ELA standards in the Office of Assessment and Standards. And I have with me today my co-pilot, who is Casey Prince Harvey. If you want to say hey this morning, Casey.
Yeah, hello. My name is Casey Prince Harvey. I am here as your support for secondary ELA today, so I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. And I am happy to have Casey. She is driving the slide deck for me this morning, so we thank her. You are going to have a note catcher / landing page that I am about to drop in the chat for you. This has some place for you to take some notes, but it also includes the slide deck or a copy of it, as well as some additional resources that I'll be sharing with you throughout the webinar. And finally, we always like to mention our high quality instructional materials. So your curriculum that has been adopted at the district level, we always encourage the use of your HQIM first, and any resources that we share in our webinars are just one of many examples, supplementary materials that can be used alongside your HQIM. So always be sure to consult that HQIM for resources and engagements to support your students' learning. And the last bit of our housekeeping is that we are offering recertification credit for each hour of webinar participation. So there are 3 requirements for that recertification credit. That is that you attend live and are an active participant, that you remain in the audience for the duration of the webinar, and then you complete the feedback survey. It is the feedback survey that we will use to send out your recertification. It's not the registration that we use, it's the feedback. So make sure that at the end of our session today, you complete that so that you can get your recertification credit. I will be sending that out within a week. So you should get an email directly from me that has all of our resources, including the recording once we get that back from our communications team, your slide deck, note catcher, and your recertification. All right, let's hop into the good stuff. So our purpose today is to equip middle-level ELA educators with some practical strategies to support students in determining the meaning of words and phrases through context clues, prior knowledge, and reference materials, which are the 3 sub-indicators for AOR 7.1. So we're going to walk through AOR 7.1, what it means, why it's important, and then I'm going to give you some immediate use strategies that you can take away and implement today if you wanted to. All right, so I want you to consider this. Take a moment to read this quote. So knowledge of individual word meanings accounts for as much as 50 to 60% of the variance in reading comprehension. That is a staggering number, and is really our why behind our 3 vocabulary standards, and why we've taken this topic as one of importance for our fall webinars. Supporting students through the acquisition and understanding of vocabulary has a huge impact on their ability to understand what they have read. So just wanted to start with a little bit of a why. Why is this important? Because students need to know 50 to 60 percent of those individual words to support their reading comprehension. So again, we're going to start with understanding the indicator itself, 7.1. Then I'm going to move into skills and strategies, and then we will close up our time together. So the first thing I want you to do is to take a look at the vertical articulation for AOR 7.1. Now again, this is in your note catcher. You can open it up and take a look at the entire vertical articulation. You can focus in just on 6 through 8 that you see on the screen. But in the chat, I want you to take a minute and just drop some of the key noticings. What vocabulary or skills draw your attention from this vertical articulation? Thank you, April. Determine or clarify the meaning of known, unknown, and multiple meaning words. Absolutely. And Casey, if you'll do one click, we have that highlighted. That's something that I pointed out as well. That is our one thing that goes through all of those grades. And then Whitney, you're exactly right. What changes a little bit are those array of strategies. Jessica, that etymology shows up in 8th grade for the first time. They're building skills, Shannon, absolutely. You can do 2 more clicks, Casey. One thing that you'll notice in 6th grade is that there is a shift. If you looked back at 5th grade and below, we were using context clues. And then when you get to 6th grade, that shifts to context. Yep, Rachel took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly. And so there is a difference between context clues and context, and we're going to look at that here in a minute. And if you didn't know already, I saw some people mention that context and etymology are bolded. In any of the vertical articulations, if there is a word in bold, that means it's the first time students have encountered that word. So in 6th grade, context being bolded means that that's a brand new skill for students. And then in 8th grade, the etymology being bold means that that's a brand new skill for our 8th grade students. So our 6th and 8th grade teachers within this indicator have something new to introduce to their students. And that's really where we're going to focus in this first part of our presentation. So let's explore what it means to be known, unknown, and multiple meaning. So those are the 3 word types that are listed specifically, grade 6 through 8 in AOR 7.1. So starting with known, this means that your students can decode the word, they can read it, and it sounds right, but they don't know the meaning. For example, the word vapid. Most students could look at that word and pronounce it, but probably a middle schooler isn't using that in their daily language. So vapid means dull or uninteresting, lacking in flavor or liveliness. So the movie had great special effects, but the plot was so vapid, I nearly fell asleep. That would be an example of a known word. I can decode it, but I don't actually know the meaning. An unknown word, this is where I can't decode it and I don't know the meaning. So my example here is sesquipedalian. Middle schoolers may look at that and have a little bit of pause on how that is pronounced, how to actually read that and break down that word, decode it. And then they probably also do not understand what that word means. It's not something that's going to come up in their daily language. Sesquipedalian is a person who uses long words or a long word itself. So our teacher is so sesquipedalian. I needed the dictionary just to understand the homework instructions. So unknown is we can't decode it and we don't know the meaning. Now, multiple meaning words, this is a word that has the same spelling, the same pronunciation in some cases, but it has different meanings. So the word present or present, if you think about the sentence, she gave him a present for his birthday, but he was present at the meeting because he needed to present his monthly report. So we've got the same word spelled the same three times, pronounced differently in two of those contexts, and also using, they have different structures. There's either a noun or a verb. Um, so that is a multiple meaning word. So specifically, the three types of words that middle school teachers are responsible for making sure students can navigate are the known, I can read it, but I don't know what it means. The unknown, I can't read it and I don't know what it means. And then the multiple meaning words, which really could be known or unknown as well, but they have to be able to navigate the context or what is the word doing in the sentence in order to know how to pronounce and make meaning of that word. Um, yes, Cynthia, talking about sounding out the syllables, and so I have hope moving forward that is going to be something that is no longer lost as our um, early childhood and elementary teachers are going through letters training, that they are going to be able to really lay that foundational knowledge, syllables and phonemic awareness, so that students come to middle school a little bit more prepared. So I'm looking forward to that. I know that Casey and I are going through letters training right now. So we're kind of in the world of learning all those foundational skills, and it has me very, very hopeful. And yes, we will be sharing the recording with you. All right, so let's look at a couple of definitions, past, known, unknown, and multiple meaning. We did mention already that context is one of the definitions. Now, from our standards glossary, which if you haven't looked at or don't know exists, is a very, very important and helpful tool. The context means the position or function of the word in the text. So that's going to be particularly helpful for our multiple meaning words. Um, Next, we have, I think etymology is going to pop up next because that is a brand new term for eighth grade. And this is the location from which a word originated, the study of word origins. This can reveal a great deal about word meaning as well as why it might follow a specific or unique phonic pattern. So, going back to those foundational skills as well in spelling. And it can include, but is not limited to, the study of Greek and Latin roots. Now, we have another standard that specifically deals with Greek and Latin roots, but we'll look later at how that indicator is really connected to this one. And then the final definition I want to show you is context clues, not because we're responsible for that, but because they are not the same. In case you can do one more click to show, these are not equal. So one thing that I think teachers and myself included as a former middle school teacher kind of fell into is that we kind of stay in the area of context clues like do you see a definition there, do you see an example or a restatement, and we don't move students into the rigor that is context. What is the function of the word of the text? Are they is this a verb, is it a noun, what is the all the words around it say in order to help students have meaning. And so I really wanted to draw a very stark connection between the two to show that they are not the same. So context clues would be those very like in your face clues that help readers interpret and understand meanings of new or unfamiliar words or phrases. And once they get to sixth grade, once students are in sixth grade through eighth grade, the rigor increases, and they're going to have to look past those simple context clues to the actual function of the word in a text. So I wanted to break that down a little bit further so that you can see maybe some specific examples on what this looks like. So context clues in grades 1 through 5 are going to focus on specific types such as definitions, restatements, and examples. Those are the 3 types of context clues that are specifically mentioned in our indicators. The instruction and the strategies used with context clues are often very guided and very concrete. Students are asked to recognize direct clues in or near a sentence. When we're looking at context in grades 6 through 8, this is much broader. It's going to consider the overall sentence, paragraph, or text, oral words function or position in the sentence, and the instruction strategies become more inferential, more analytical. So students are really having to interpret a word using the broader structural context rather than just nearby clues. Oh, thank you, Angelica. You're welcome. So let's look at a couple of examples. So we know that the types of context clues that are included in the standards for grades 1 through 5 are number 1, examples. So this is when a text uses an example to help explain the meaning of a word or phrase, and that's first introduced in first grade. Our second is definitions. So the definition is explained or given directly after the word's use, and that is introduced in second grade. And then restatements are introduced in grade 4. So when a word or phrase is said in a simpler way or using a more familiar word with a similar meaning. Now, I will say that if I tell the elementary teachers when you're trying to distinguish between specifically definitions and restatements, they are very similar. And what one person may call a restatement, another person may call a definition, and that's fine. But these are the 3 specific types of context clues mentioned in the ELA standards. Notice the last one is introduced in 4th grade. The first one is introduced in 1st grade. That means by the time students are in middle school, this should no longer be our instructional focus. Now, it may be helpful to revisit the context clues with students to ensure they have those tools in their toolbox to navigate unfamiliar vocabulary, but that is not where we can live as middle school teachers. We have to be able to move forward and increase the rigor for our students. Absolutely, Shayla. So let's look at some specific examples of what it could look like differently for elementary versus middle school. So a context clue in grades 1 through 5, the desert is arid, which means it is extremely dry and gets very little rain. So you may call this either a restatement or a definition, but it makes it clear what arid means. That would be something we would expect from elementary school. Now let's look at a different example that requires context. So after walking for hours through the rugged terrain, the hikers were too weary to continue before resting. Now, there is no restatement, there is no definition explicitly included in that sentence. So students must infer from the overall situation. They're walking for hours. They need to rest. That weary is probably going to mean I'm tired or exhausted. So just thinking through that quickly in the chat, how might your teaching or your instruction shift when students are moving from those very specific clues, such as a restatement clue or a definition clue, to inferring meaning from overall situations? How do you think that looks in instruction? How do you differ? How does that differ? And you're welcome to unmute or drop in the chat. Whitney, thank you. Yeah, providing real world examples and background knowledge. And we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about background knowledge here in just a few minutes. Lots of modeling. Absolutely, Rachel. It's hard to teach students how to infer, right? That's one of our overarching expectations. And sometimes that's an innate skill. You've got to be able to connect those dots. And so modeling, providing background knowledge, giving examples. Very good. All right, let's look at another example. Oh, Melanie, absolutely. Students have to be able to discuss their thinking. All right, so the volcano lay dormant or inactive for hundreds of years before it suddenly erupted. So this is very clearly a definition clue. Immediately after the word dormant, it is defined as inactive. So with 6 through 8, an example of context would be the teacher's conciliatory, the teacher's tone was conciliatory, hoping to ease the tension after the heated debate. So again, there's no definition, there's no restatement. Students must consider the function of the word in the sentence. And in this case, it's describing the teacher's tone. Now, the broader situation is that there was a heated debate. And that the teacher wanted to ease that tension. So even if students didn't know the exact definition of this word, they can infer that they're describing a teacher's tone as maybe calming or peaceful, wanting to really bring that heated discussion down. So again, broader context, you've got to consider the function of the word. One more example. We've got the boy brought miscellaneous items to school, such as a paperclip, a marble, a cheese stick, and a feather. Sounds like my 6-year-old's book bag, right? But this is a great example of an example context clue. This helps students understand that miscellaneous means a mix of different unrelated things. All right, so that's how it would look in grades 1 through 5. Let's see another context example in grades 6, 8. The lawyer's meticulous preparation for the trial impressed the entire courtroom. There's no examples, there's no restatement, there's no definition. What can the students use to understand what meticulous means?
Okay, question.
Um,
I need to get this
so
back
let's
up, but I
make
need to
sure
turn
that
the
we
volume.
stay muted, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Um, Students must understand that meticulous describes the lawyer's preparation. So again, that's a describing word. And from the tone and the use of the word impressed, they can infer that it was something good, right? And so again, even if they can't get the very specific definition of thorough or very careful, they'll know that that means that the lawyer has done something well in his preparation for the trial. So I just wanted you to have some concrete examples of really what does that actually look like in it as I'm making planning for instruction and able to help build my students background knowledge in context as opposed to context clues. So I hope that that helped make that clear as you move forward on expectations for middle school students. Now, the other term that we picked out from looking at the vertical articulation was etymology. So etymology shows how prefixes, suffixes affect meaning. It can link unfamiliar words to known root words, explains why a word means what it does and not just what it means, and it helps students transfer knowledge across content areas and across disciplines. But what I specifically wanted to bring your attention to is AOR.7.1. So this is our third vocabulary standard. Build and apply a range of academic vocabulary as grade level appropriate morphology, so our Greek and Latin roots. Now, if you look in the vertical articulation for AOR 9.1, what grade does etymology show up first in that indicator? And I've got the clip right there for you.
And English 1.
In English 1. So In 7.1, etymology is introduced in 8th grade, and in 9.1, it's introduced in English 1. So it's important to note, 8th grade teachers, that when we're instructing for 7.1, that you're laying a foundation that English 1 teachers are going to be able to use in 9.1 in the following year. So I did just want to show that connection between those two indicators. All right, so that was very quick rundown of the expectations of 7.1. So in the chat, I want you to take everything that we've talked about so far and just turn it into one important statement. So based on what we've explored and discussed, what's one statement that connects all that information together as what you would consider to be the most important thing? And you can drop that in your chat or in the chat. You can unmute. And there's also space on your note catcher for you to write that down. So I'm going to give you a few minutes just to put that in the chat. Yes, Shannon. So learning vocabulary strategies has a huge impact on overall comprehension. Context clues, grades 1 through 5, and inferred context in grades 6, 8. Absolutely. Middle school students need practice determining meaning without explicit context clues. Very good. We need to be increasing the rigor and taking off the training wheels. I love that analogy, so that students can think more deeply about the words within the context of a sentence. Understanding the vertical articulation of the standards can inform how teachers should adjust instruction. Vocabulary knowledge builds from grades to grades. Absolutely excellent. Make sure students have that foundation for making inferences, modeling thinking strategies, how to teach word functions in a sentence by knowing the different types. Absolutely. And that brings you in a little bit into some of your C4.1, those parts of speech when those are coming into instruction as well in the earlier grades. So making sure students understand that, that it's not as important for students to just say, I know what an adjective is. It's a describing word. I know what a noun is, person, place, or thing. But what does that actually mean in the context of a sentence or a larger text? Yeah, synonyms and antonyms. Very good. All right. I'm so glad that you had some takeaways from that, just understanding AOR 7.1. So now we're going to go into some skills and strategies where I hopefully will give you a couple tools that you can walk away with and use right away. We're going to start with looking at each sub-indicator within 7.1 specifically and giving strategies for each of the sub-indicators. So I'm going to pause for a second because I saw Cynthia put a great question in. How do we accommodate the students who lack the proper elementary foundation and context clues? And that's a great question because we know that students come to us with gaps and really across the board, not just 7.1. And I think that, my message is always going to be that in Tier 1 instruction, we have to teach students at the grade level for what they're in. So they have to be exposed to grade level expectations in Tier 1 whole group instruction. And those accommodations are going to come in your Tier 2 instruction, in your small groups, your scaffolding, the supports that you give those students. But again, students have to be exposed to those grade level expectations first and foremost. So absolutely support those students with scaffolds in Tier 1 and then help shore up some of those gaps in your Tier 2 small group instruction. So AOR 7.1 is the sub-indicator A is where we use context. So when we're talking about context versus context clues, this sub-indicator A that asks us to focus on context. So I'm going to give you, I believe, 2 strategies that you can use to help help students walk through that idea of context. So the first one I've just called function finder, where students analyze how a word's placement and function in a sentence influences its meaning. So the sentence I'm using as my example is she decided to book the tickets early. Now, typically, if I say book, you're going to think noun, right? Something I can read. In this case, it's not acting as a noun. So how do we figure out what it means? Your first step would be to ask what job is the word doing? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? Is it something else? And then discuss with students how a word's position in a sentence determines its role. Then, step two, you want to explore examples where the same word functions differently. So, talk about, well, if it's functioning this way in this sentence, where else have I seen the word? How else can it function? For this example, I read a great book last night. That's where it's a noun. The third step would be rewriting the sentence with a synonym. Someone just mentioned synonyms that fits that same role. So if I said she decided to book the tickets early, what's a word that could fill that place without using the word book? Well, she decided to reserve the tickets early. So this process of thinking about, your example and what it's doing in the sentence, maybe some, for lack of a better word, non-examples. When does that word function differently? And then what other words can function in its place is going to help students with context understand what that word means. It allows them to focus on the grammar and the sentence structure, not surrounding hints, to determine the overall meaning of the word. Another strategy, big picture meaning. So this is where you might have a longer sentence or even a paragraph where you're going to have to look at the bigger picture to clarify words or phrases. So our example here, the trial ended after several days of testimony. The lawyer disagreed with the outcome, so she will appeal the decision made by the court and hopes that a higher court will review the case. So step one, discuss what's happening in the whole paragraph. In general, give me a summary. Well, someone lost a trial and they're not satisfied with the result. So what role does the unknown word play? So again, we're going back to the function. In this case, it's a verb or the action of this second sentence here. And then your third would be to just generate possible meanings that make sense in that broader context. So thinking through, it is an action, and it's an action that a lawyer can take in response to a decision. So let's think a little bit background knowledge, discussion. What can lawyers do if they don't agree with an outcome in a court decision? Well, they can say they want to do the trial again. Maybe that's what appeal means. So in this strategy, just really stopping to think about and have conversation about that bigger picture. Students are connecting that unknown word to the text overall meaning, their background knowledge, logical flow of what's happening, and not just single word context clue hints. So those are just two thinking strategies that you can use with students to walk them through a process of understanding the bigger picture or the function of the words in context. Now for 7.1b, sub indicator B, this is all about background knowledge. So someone mentioned background knowledge earlier. So this is one of the biggest things that we can do for our students is to help activate or build the background knowledge. So take a look at this quote. Students must understand 90 to 95% of the words on a page to understand the content. The other 5 to 10% of word meanings can then likely be inferred from context. So think for a minute. When's the last time you read something where you weren't familiar with 90 to 95% of the words? And how did that feel? Or how would it feel if you could not understand 90 to 95% of the words? You're not going to have any idea what's going on. That's like me picking up a surgeon's manual or some kind of science related thing that I have no idea about. I can't infer what any of the words mean. So we've got to be able to provide students with the background knowledge that can make up for the 5 to 10% um, of what they may not understand in the 90 to 95%. And Casey said it's definitely happened to her when she's read her husband's IT documents. Absolutely. So how do we do that? 90 to 95% of words is a lot of words. We've got to be able to provide students with an understanding of 90 to 95% of the words so that they can infer the other 5 to 10. And the biggest question that we get over and over is, well, what words do we teach? How do we make a vocabulary list? How are we going to get students to that 90 to 95% threshold? Um, what do we teach? And so in vocabulary, we have your tiered words, you tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Your tier 1 words are those common, easy to understand words, table, walk, mud, with, things that students are using daily. Your tier 2 words are more sophisticated. They can be used in many contexts and situations. And so we want to push in the tier 2 words daily. So words like endure, original, contain, annoyed, particular, that may not come up in students' daily language, but they're going to see frequently. And then finally, um, tier 3 words, where they have specific meanings and are used only when talking about certain subjects. Like Casey was talking about her husband's IT document. So the tier 2 is our sweet spot for explicit vocabulary instruction. However, instruction in tier 2 words relies on prior knowledge of tier 1 words, and some students may still need instruction in tier 1 words. So again, there's always that place where we need to pull students for our tier 2 instruction in our classroom to help build the tier 1 vocabulary. So this idea is why teachers should not solely rely on predetermined list of vocabulary to teach as outlined by a text or even a curriculum. It's really important for teachers to know their students' background knowledge, their experiences, familiarity with vocabulary that's going to be in the text, to know which words students need to be explicitly taught. So over the next few slides, I'm going to discuss some examples of helpful tips for explicit vocabulary instruction. And I do see some questions coming up in the chat asking about SE Ready not giving, background knowledge. So how does that work with cold reads? I think that is where students are going to have to push into the sub-indicator A and using the context to come up with some of that meaning for vocabulary. And is there a resource for tier 2 words from the state? And Julie, there's not currently a resource. We are working on a resource for K-8 involving morphology, Greek and Latin roots, and we're also working on a secondary foundational skills document that will support vocabulary in part. So those things are coming at some point. They're in process. I can't promise a date, but they're on the way. That hopefully will provide some support there, but you're not going to get a list of tier 2 words. And again, just of what I just said is the reason is because there's no 2 classrooms of students that are the same, and the lists are going to be really based on what your students' current background knowledge and needs are in your classroom. So a couple of things to think about when we're talking about explicit vocabulary instruction. First, pre-teach the vocabulary before you get into the content. So, reading new words takes up space in our working memory, which means that it's going to take up a great deal of the time and effort that should be used to figure out the meaning of the entire passage, so the comprehension piece as a whole. But if we're reading new words that are maybe known or unknown, that's going to take up some of that capacity to comprehend the text as a whole. So pre-teaching vocabulary frees up that working memory so that comprehension is more easily achieved. So information is going to be stored, it's going to be retrieved more easily, and then students are going to be able to apply other reading skills such as the inferencing, the making predictions, the comparisons, making connections, as well as filtering out what information is important from the details that are not important. So that's one thing you can do from the get-go is consider your students' background knowledge, their current abilities, and pre-read the text to pull out some vocabulary that you think they're going to need to know ahead of time. So how do you do that? One strategy that I have for you is called graphic gallery graffiti. If you've been in some of our professional development before, you've probably seen this strategy used differently, but I'm giving you this example in the context of vocabulary. So you may choose your words. In this example, I've chosen the word foreshadowing. So I will give the word, and then I will provide students with essentially is a Freyer model. It's just not shaped exactly like a typical Freyer model. And please make sure that you're muted. Thank you. So I've given the word, I've given the definition, an example in a sentence, and then synonyms and antonyms. So students have all the information they need to know to understand what the word foreshadowing means, and I'm just giving it to them. So after we've given them that information, I'm going to have them create a graphic that represents the word. So if you look on your screen, here's an example of what students could create on chart paper, on a piece of white paper, however you want to do it. But this imaginary group of students created a magic ball. What are those called? A crystal ball. Crystal ball. And in it, they put a textbook so that it's showing that as I'm reading, I can look into the future and see what's going to happen, or it's giving me clues with the magnifying glass about what's going to happen. So that is the graphic portion of this activity. That leads over to our gallery portion, where you would put the posters up. Students would go around and look at all the different posters. Now, you could have everyone have the same word. Each small group could have a different word. And so they're looking maybe to see from the image, could I understand what foreshadowing means, or whatever vocabulary word that you may have given. And then next, and Casey, if you'll click, would be the graffiti portion. So after they've had a chance to go around and look at all of the posters, ask them to provide some graffiti on those posters. What are you thinking foreshadowing means based on the image that your classmates drew? And so you can see in this particular example, someone wrote, you must have to look at a book carefully to see foreshadowing. Could for be short for before? Is that a fortune teller ball? Does this have something to do with seeing the future? What does a shadow have to do with anything, right? Like, why does it say foreshadowing? So from the graffiti, you could then have greater conversations as a class about what those words mean, and you've got expert groups who can guide that conversation. So a couple of questions. Absolutely, Shayla, teachers can pre-teach that vocabulary using the strategies outlined in 7.1. Absolutely, context, this background knowledge. The next sub-indicator C is about reference materials. So absolutely. Rachel, does each student have a different word in this scenario and they're guessing the meaning of other students' words? So you can do it really any way you want, Rachel. In my head, I picture small groups of students working on one word together, and each word would be different, or they could all have the same word, and then you could compare and contrast how was your understanding different from another student's. So it could work either way. Absolutely. So my second piece of advice for explicit vocabulary instruction is to help students make connections between words. So when students can find connections between words, they're, again, more easily stored and remembered for later use. children learn new words by making connections to words and concepts they already know. So by categorizing and classifying words, instruction, it just really helps create a way for students to organize and easily retrieve that learning. So, if you look at the earlier vertical articulation of vocabulary, you'll notice that some expectations for our kindergarten, first grade students is to put words into categories, right? These are all weather related, or these words are all related to family. Then it gets a little bit more sophisticated with vocabulary as students get older. So all of these are related to the Industrial Revolution, right? But students from a young age are being taught to categorize and make connections between words. So when we get to making connections in middle school, an example of a strategy might be just semantic mapping. So when you're implementing semantic mapping with secondary students in terms of vocabulary, you may start with a new vocabulary word in the center, write it on the board, on a large sheet of paper, whatever it may be, give students in groups individual words, however you want to do it. And then just ask students to suggest related words, concepts, definitions, examples, synonyms, antonyms, places they've seen this word or parts of the word before, and then connect those ideas to that central word using lines or whatever you want to do to create a map, so to speak. And then it's always important to maybe think back, how can we label these types of connections? So going back and having the conversation, like in this particular example, perspective, you've got synonyms, could be viewpoint, outlook, or standpoint, reminding students that the relationship between perspective and these words here are a synonym. So you can make these maps as big as you want them to, with as many connections as students can come up with. And then you can use the map to engage students in creating sentences, finding the words in context, creating a definition for that specific word. So this example, students may notice that spec is one of their Greek and Latin roots, that they often talk about perspective in class when we're also talking about point of view. Are those the same or are they different? One student says, I talked about perspective in art class when we talked about 3D objects. So how is that tied in? I remember when we read the Three Little Pigs story from the wolf's perspective. This reminds me of the word perception. I wonder what per means. So these are all very thoughtful conversations that you can have with students to help them start building background knowledge, and also thinking about the context. Could this word mean different things based on how it's being used in a different content area? So a great strategy, again, to deepen that understanding of words in general, and it could also be used in pre-teaching vocabulary that they are going to come up against in a text you're going to read. And then finally, my last point for explicit vocabulary instruction is that we just cannot rely on definitions alone. That is one of the least effective methods of vocabulary instruction, is solely using a dictionary. And this is mostly because definitions are written to be as short and concise as possible. Words can have multiple meanings or multiple parts of speech, and students may have a difficulty navigating which particular function they should be looking for. For example, the word obscure can be used as an adjective or a verb. The definition of ambiguous includes the words liable, interpretation, uncertain, indefinite. Those words in and of themselves are going to have students having to look them up. So they can't, there's so many words in the definition that they don't understand the definition as a whole, right? And then like attribute could also be attribute. Just depends on how you are using that word in a sentence. So it's very important to not rely solely on, hey, get the dictionary, look up what the word means. it's probably more effective that if you do want to provide a definition, that you, the teacher, gives them the definition, kind of like in the graphic graffiti example, where you provide them with the information they need ahead of time, and then they do the work with that student already, or excuse me, with that word, with a definition that you have provided. Now, this rolls right into sub-bullet C, because students do need to know how to use references and reference materials. That is a skill that is in the standards and indicators. It is in sub-bullet C, and we can't ignore that, you know, today's age, you can just Google what does this word mean, and they don't even need to pick up a dictionary, but they're going to come in contact potentially with SC Ready, where they're given a dictionary excerpt and they got to figure out what it means and how to read that. And so it is important that we consult our reference materials and that students know how to do that. Now, there's two lenses that I really want you to look through, and that's access and usage. So, do students have access to a variety of reference materials, the dictionary, thesaurus, glossary? Do they have them hard copy in your room? Maybe they have access to glossaries through their instructional materials, remembering also that there is a glossary for the ELA standards. That's a valuable tool because those definitions were crafted to specifically align to the intent of our ELA indicators. But you also want to consider usage. So, are students aware of how to use these unique features of the materials to navigate the information and gain understanding? So if we think about our HQIM, I looked through the high quality instructional materials that are adopted in middle schools across our state, and every single one of them has at least an example of a reference material. So Casey, if you'll click, this is just one example that I pulled from an HQIM, and I can't even remember which curriculum this is now, but there are resources in your textbooks that help walk students through how to read a dictionary entry, right? In this particular case, notice that the etymology is included. How can eighth grade teachers bring that in? So really pressing into the resources that you have in your HQIM can be a helpful tool in making sure that students have both access and can use reference materials well. So that was just something that I wanted to give a quick plug as the strategy for reference materials is to use your textbook, use what's in there and provided for you. Now, I also wanted to draw a connection back to one of the strategies I mentioned earlier, which is the big picture meaning, and look specifically at step 3, where it says generate possible meanings that make sense in the larger context. Well, what if the student doesn't understand the larger context? What if they're having a comprehension issue overall and they just don't understand the entire paragraph or text, short story, poem, whatever it is? Well, then can we lean into the reference materials? Can you look at a dictionary definition, and even if it has 2 or 3 definitions based on the function of the word, can they kind of put those definitions in the passage and see, oh, does that help clear up some of my confusion? Does that help me with the context? And so I think it's important to remember that these A, B, and C, these skills, these sub indicators don't necessarily have to be used or taught on their own, that these are things that work in conjunction with one another. And students really need to be able to pull those pieces together when they're coming across words that are difficult and that they can't automatically figure out or navigate. All right, so I want you to pause and ponder. We're right on time here, finishing up our hour together. I want you to put in the chat or unmute, think about how might these strategies, this learning that you've had today in the last hour, impact your planning, instruction, or support around 7.1 moving forward? So what are you thinking as we wrap this up? What's going through your head? April, thank you. Yeah, so perspective of an elementary coach and how essential it is that they're laying that context clues foundation so that students are ready to increase the rigor in middle school. Thank you for that. Yes, more work with reference materials. Absolutely. I as a when I was in a classroom, 100% that was me. I did not focus on that enough. Um, Thinking about how to teach into making inferences based on context, how to bring that etymology in for eighth grade since it hasn't been much of a focus in the past. Absolutely. Helping teachers select the best tier two words to focus on. I love that, Sarah. Thank you, Casey. She said she appreciates how many of the strategies and reminders also support instruction for our special populations, particularly our ML population. Um, Thank you, Megan. Yes, so right here, special populations, understanding the tier one and tier two parts of speech and how that's important. And again, I fell into that like trap of, hey, my students could say that an adjective is a describing word and a noun's a person, place, or thing. So yay, we got parts of speech, but really not moving into the rigor of, well, what does that mean for the function in the sentence, and how does that help me discover what words mean or overall understand the overall context of the passage. Thank you, Julie. Simple and powerful strategies students that teachers can tie into what they're already doing. Katie, that is a great point. That making sure we're choosing our instructional text so that we can explicitly teach these skills. Something else that I wish I did better as a teacher. I'd be a much better teacher now than I actually was, I think, is that we choose our text with intention. That, if I'm teaching sub-indicator A today, the text I pick better have some examples of that in it. A deeper dive, Sandra, yes, into those vocabulary standards. Um, oh, great point, Melanie. The strategies today have the students doing the work. Absolutely. I love the reference to the work that elementary teachers are doing with science of reading. Um, the very good, an SLP with us today. I love that. Thank you all so much for that feedback. Again, this is recorded, and within the next week or so, we've got to send the recording to our communications department, who then makes it accessible, puts the closed captioning in, and then they send it back to us. When I get that back, I will send an email to all registrants. With the slide deck, the note catcher, and the recording. And then soon after that, you will get your recertification credit as well. But in order to get your recertification credit, I do need your feedback form. And so I did have a final reflection built in, but we have already done that. You guys were already doing that in your chat just then. So I just want you, hopefully, have seen that we've met our purpose for today, and that is to give you practical strategies to support students in determining meaning of words and phrases through context clues, prior knowledge, and reference materials. So hopefully you felt that was successful.